The logo on the paper carried the same name that destroyed her family. That night, under golden rooftop lights overlooking the Chicago River, a millionaire laughed and raised his glass. "I'll give you $100,000 if you can actually speak Chinese." The whole restaurant burst into laughter. Phones lifted, cameras rolled. A quiet black waitress stood in the center of it all. But what they didn't know, they had just challenged the wrong woman. And when she began to speak, well, it wasn't just a language that filled the room. It was a buried truth rising back to life. The rooftop of the Avalon Grill shimmered under soft golden lights, 28 stories above the Chicago River. Glass walls reflected the skyline like a painting. Steel, water, and fading sunset stitched together in quiet luxury. Crystal glasses chimed gently against porcelain. The low hum of expensive conversations floated through the air, polished and controlled, like everything else in the room. As Danielle Carter moved between tables with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned how to take up as little space as possible. Her black apron was crisp, her white blouse spotless. She carried a tray of wine glasses, as if balancing something fragile beyond glass. Her dignity, perhaps. Most nights, she was invisible. At table 12, a group of investors in tailored suits leaned toward one another, discussing numbers that sounded like phone codes to anyone outside their world. And at the center sat Richard Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Technologies. 50 years old, silver hair brushed back, a watch that cost more than Danielle made in a year. He had arrived 30 minutes late, as if the laws of time bent politely for him. Danielle approached with a water pitcher. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly. "Still or sparkling?" He didn't look at her at first. His eyes scanned the skyline behind her reflection in the glass. Still, no ice. She poured carefully. Across the table, one of the visiting investors, an older gentleman with kind eyes and a quiet presence, studied the menu. He frowned slightly and said something in Mandarin to the woman beside him. Danielle heard it immediately. A question about the preparation of the sea bass, whether it contained shellfish. She leaned closer, her voice soft and respectful. "It doesn't, sir," she answered in Mandarin. "But the sauce has oyster extract. But I can have the kitchen prepare it without." The gentleman blinked in surprise, then smiled warmly. "Thank you," he replied in Mandarin, clearly relieved. Danielle nodded and stepped back. Richard Whitmore's head turned slowly. "What did you just say?" he asked, not to the investor, but to her. "I clarified the ingredients for him," Danielle said evenly. "In Chinese?" His lips curved into a half smile. "Yes, sir." The table quieted. A few nearby guests leaned subtly in their seats. But Richard leaned back in his chair, lifting his wine glass with theatrical slowness. "Well," he said loudly enough for 3 surrounding tables to hear, "that's impressive." A couple of his associates chuckled, sensing performance. He raised his voice slightly more. "I'll give you $100,000 if you can actually serve us in Mandarin." The words landed like a dropped plate. Conversation around them faded. A fork paused mid-air. Someone near the bar lifted their phone, but recording without shame. Richard smiled, pleased with the silence he'd created. "Go on," he continued. "Take the entire order, in Mandarin. No cheating, no little memorized tricks." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread across the room. Danielle felt the heat rise in her chest, but her face remained still. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, waiting for embarrassment, for refusal, for collapse. She thought of South Side mornings, of cracked sidewalks and the bus that hissed like an old radiator when it stopped. Of her mother sitting at the kitchen table counting pills beside a stack of overdue bills. She thought of her father's voice from years ago, gentle and firm. "Respect isn't what they give, it's what you carry." Danielle looked directly at Richard Whitmore. "If that's what you'd like, sir," she said calmly. She turned to the older investor first, speaking in fluent Mandarin, clear tone, precise phrasing. She asked about spice preferences, portion size, wine pairing. She shifted naturally into a more formal register, appropriate for business elders. The older man responded easily, impressed. A few guests at neighboring tables began whispering. She moved to the woman beside him, adjusting her dialect subtly when she heard the regional inflection in her accent. Then to another guest. She translated menu descriptions smoothly, answering follow-up questions about preparation methods and sourcing, with no hesitation, no stumble. By the time she reached Richard, the entire rooftop had fallen into a strained hush. She addressed him in Mandarin as well, repeating his preferred order from memory: smoked salmon, sauce modification, no garnish. Richard's smile tightened. "That's enough," he said abruptly, switching back to English. Danielle stood still. One of the Chinese investors cleared his throat softly. "Her Mandarin is excellent," he said in English. "Oh, very professional." Richard forced a chuckle. "Anyone can memorize phrases," he replied. "It's a party trick." The laughter this time was thinner. Danielle folded her order pad quietly. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Whitmore?" For a split second, something flickered in his expression. Annoyance, perhaps, or recalculation. "No," he said sharply. "That will be all." She nodded and stepped away, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. As she walked toward the kitchen doors, she felt the air shift behind her. The performance hadn't gone the way Richard expected. He had meant to entertain, to reduce, to demonstrate hierarchy. Instead, something had tilted. In the reflection of the glass wall, she caught a glimpse of herself, small against the skyline, yet unbowed. Behind her, Richard Whitmore took a long sip of wine, eyes fixed on the city lights. The laughter had stopped, and for the first time that evening, he wasn't smiling. But Richard Whitmore watched Danielle disappear through the kitchen doors, the soft swing of them swallowing her whole. Around him, conversations slowly restarted, but something had shifted in the air. The investors were no longer leaning toward him. They were glancing toward the kitchen. He set his glass down harder than necessary. "Interesting staff you have," one of the Chinese partners said carefully. Richard forced a laugh. "Talent shows up in unexpected places." But his tone carried an edge now, thin and metallic. An hour later, long after dessert plates had been cleared and the skyline faded into night, Danielle stepped out of the staff entrance into the cold Chicago air. The wind coming off the river bit through her thin coat. Neon reflections trembled in puddles along the sidewalk. She waited for the number 3 bus under a flickering streetlight. The city after midnight felt different, quieter, honest. Not her phone buzzed. Her mother. "You off work, baby?" her mother asked, voice tired but warm. "Yes, ma'am." "You sound like you're thinking too loud." Danielle smiled faintly. "Just a long night." "You always did stand too tall for rooms that wanted you smaller," her mother said gently. "Just don't let them shrink your heart." The bus arrived with a sigh of brakes. Danielle climbed aboard and slid into a cracked vinyl seat near the back. The warmth inside smelled like metal and old coats. About a man asleep 2 rows up leaned against the window, head rocking with every stop. As the bus rolled south, downtown's glitter gave way to boarded storefronts and corner liquor stores glowing under buzzing fluorescent lights. South Side. Home. She stepped off near 63rd Street and walked the last 3 blocks. Snow from last week lingered in gray piles along the curb. A dog barked somewhere behind a chain-link fence. Her apartment building stood narrow and stubborn, brick-worn but standing. And inside, the hallway radiator clanged like it was arguing with itself. She unlocked the door quietly. Her mother sat at the small kitchen table under a single hanging bulb. an open pill organizer beside her, and a crossword puzzle half finished. "You ate?" her mother asked. "At work," Danielle replied. That wasn't entirely true. She set down her bag and knelt to rub her mother's shoulders. The older woman winced slightly, then relaxed. "You should have been a doctor," her mother murmured. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." But even as she said it, something inside her stirred. After helping her mother to bed, Danielle washed her hands slowly at the sink. The faucet dripped between turns. She stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror, the quiet waitress, the girl who once sat in lecture halls at Northwestern, arguing about syntax and machine translation algorithms, at the girl who left halfway through her degree when hospital bills piled up and the scholarship committee said there was nothing more they could do. She walked into the living room and knelt beside a worn wooden chest tucked beneath the window. The skyline was barely visible from here, just a faint orange glow in the distance. She opened the chest. Inside lay notebooks, yellowed research printouts, a flash drive taped to an envelope. To sit at that same kitchen table, with headphones on, translating conference calls between engineers in Shanghai and developers in Silicon Valley. He would pause recordings and explain nuances to her, why a word wasn't just a word, why tone mattered more than grammar. "Language is a bridge," he'd tell her, "and bridges collapse when pride gets in the way." She opened the leather journal, pages filled with neat handwriting, flowcharts, fragments of Mandarin characters beside lines of code, notes about ethical safeguards in AI translation systems, how they should protect cultural meaning, not flatten it. Her chest tightened. 3 years ago, when Whitmore Technologies acquired the startup her father consulted for, everything unraveled. Contracts became lawsuits. Lawsuits became silence. And then came the accident on an icy highway that ended all appeals. Officially, it was just business. Officially, nothing illegal had happened. But the house was gone within a year. Danielle closed the journal slowly. She thought about Richard Whitmore's face tonight, the flash of irritation when she spoke fluently, the way he needed the room to laugh. She wasn't angry. That was the strange part. She was tired. The next morning came early, as pale winter sunlight pushed through thin curtains. Danielle dressed in jeans and a thick sweater before heading to the community kitchen 3 blocks away. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and canned soup. Folding tables lined the room. Volunteers moved quietly, stacking bread and ladling oatmeal into paper bowls. Danielle tied on an apron and got to work. An elderly man named Mr. Alvarez struggled to carry his tray. She steadied it for him and switched into Spanish, asking about his granddaughter's school recital. His face lit up. A teenage girl sat alone near the back, coat still on, eyes red from crying. Danielle sat beside her and listened. No judgment, no rush. By noon, her feet ached, but her heart felt steadier. Kindness had always been her anchor, not because the world rewarded it, but because it reminded her who she was. As she stepped outside, she noticed 2 teenage boys watching a video on a phone. She heard her own voice faintly through tinny speakers, Mandarin flowing over restaurant clatter. One of the boys glanced up at her. "Hey, that's you, right?" Danielle froze. The clip cut just as Richard's voice echoed, offering $100,000. The comments scrolled rapidly beneath it. "Who is she? She destroyed him. Bet she's faking." Danielle swallowed. The world was watching now. And somewhere in a glass tower downtown, she suspected Richard Whitmore was too. So by late afternoon, the clip had spread far beyond the South Side bus stop. Danielle's phone vibrated every few minutes with notifications she didn't ask for. Old classmates from Northwestern sent hesitant messages. Former professors left voicemails she hadn't returned. Strangers debated her accent in comment sections as if fluency were a trick instead of years of devotion. She muted the notifications. Fame, if that was what this was, felt cold. It didn't warm the apartment. Danielle stepped into the staff entrance. Danielle stepped into the staff entrance that evening. She could feel the difference immediately. The dishwasher paused mid-scrub. A hostess gave her a small, nervous smile. Someone whispered her name like it had suddenly gained weight. Mrs. Lillian, the restaurant's longtime manager, stood near the coat rack with her arms folded. "Right?" she asked quietly. "I'm fine." "Right?" she asked quietly. "I'm fine." "You sure?" "Because Mr. Whitmore requested you personally for tonight." Danielle's heartbeat skipped once. "For service?" she asked. "For the investor follow-up dinner. Private section." The restaurant floor glittered as usual, but the atmosphere felt tighter, like a room holding its breath. There were fewer people at the table. 3 were fewer people at the table. 3 investors, 1 legal advisor, and a man in a dark suit who didn't speak much. Richard didn't smile when he saw her. "Miss Carter," he said evenly, "I understand you've become quite popular." "I'm just doing my job, sir." "Of course you are." He motioned for her to pour wine. She did so without trembling. For a while, business talk resumed. Project timelines, global rollout strategies, partnerships in Beijing and Singapore. Danielle moved in and out of the conversation like air, present but unseen. Until a commotion broke the rhythm. A sudden crash echoed from near the bar. A tray had fallen. A guest shouted. Danielle turned instinctively. An elderly man, different from the night before, clutched his throat, panic flashing across his face. Yet his wife tried to explain in Mandarin between gasps. Danielle was already moving. She knelt beside him, speaking quickly but gently in Mandarin, asking about allergies, what he had eaten. He pointed weakly to a shrimp garnish he hadn't realized was in his salad. The kitchen staff froze, unsure what to do. Danielle guided the wife to find the man's medication in his jacket pocket. She explained clearly to the staff to call emergency services, or switching back to English to relay symptoms precisely. Her voice never rose. Her hands remained steady. Within minutes, the man's breathing eased. Paramedics arrived to check him, confirming it was a mild allergic reaction caught in time. The dining room, once tense with curiosity, shifted into something else. Respect. The elderly wife bowed her head to Danielle, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said in Mandarin. "You saved him from something worse." Danielle smiled softly. "I'm glad he's okay." Across the room, Richard Whitmore stood very still. He had watched the entire exchange. He had seen the difference between performance and purpose. When Danielle returned to the table to refill water glasses, Richard spoke low enough that only she could hear. "You could have embarrassed me tonight," he said. "Instead, you chose to play nurse. It wasn't about you." His jaw tightened slightly. "You enjoy this?" he asked. "Oh, the attention?" "I didn't ask for it." He leaned back in his chair. "You realize videos fade. Trends die. The internet moves on." She met his eyes calmly. "Kindness doesn't." Something flickered again in his expression. Irritation mixed with something closer to curiosity. Later, after the investors left and the lights dimmed, Richard lingered near the balcony overlooking the river. Danielle stepped outside to collect empty glasses from a side table, while the wind off the water cut through the night. Chicago's skyline glowed like distant embers. "Where did you really learn Mandarin?" he asked suddenly. "My father," she replied. "Was he a professor?" "He worked in AI language systems." Richard's gaze sharpened. "For whom?" Danielle hesitated for half a breath. "A startup. Years ago." Richard turned to face her fully now. "What was its name?" She watched him carefully. "Lingua Bridge." The name hung between them. As Richard's expression changed, subtle but undeniable. Whitmore Technologies had acquired Lingua Bridge 3 years earlier. You worked there? He asked. My father did. And he passed. A pause stretched out. Richard looked back toward the skyline. Lingua Bridge was absorbed legitimately, he said. Consultants were compensated. Danielle didn't argue. She simply held his gaze long enough to let silence speak. Inside the restaurant, Mrs. Lillian watched through the glass. Be careful, she murmured to herself. On her way home that night, Danielle didn't take the bus immediately. She walked along the river for a few blocks, cold air clearing her head. The city lights reflected on the water like broken stars. Lingua Bridge. She hadn't said that name aloud in years. Her father's final months had been filled with meetings about ethical safeguards, about preventing corporations from stripping cultural nuance from translation engines in the pursuit of profit. After the acquisition, he had grown quieter, more worried. She reached her apartment and went straight to the wooden chest again. This time she pulled out the flash drive taped to the old envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she plugged it into her aging laptop. Folders opened slowly. Research drafts, email chains, contract revisions. And there, embedded in a patent draft, an early version of the translation algorithm credited to Marcus Carter. She scrolled further. But later versions showed revisions, and then abruptly, his name gone, replaced by Whitmore Technologies' development team. Danielle leaned back in her chair. Her heart pounded in her ears. Outside, a siren wailed faintly in the distance. On her screen, the timeline told a story she had never fully allowed herself to read. Not an accident. Not just business. Erasure. Her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. This is Grace Lynn from the Chicago Tribune. Well, we need to talk about your father. Danielle stared at the message for a long moment, the blue light of her laptop casting sharp shadows across the kitchen wall. Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane in the living room window. Somewhere upstairs, a neighbor's television murmured through thin ceilings. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Journalists didn't call people like her. They called CEOs. They called attorneys. They called men in glass towers who could afford to spin stories. But the flash drive was still open on her screen. Her father's name had been there. Then it wasn't. Her phone buzzed again. I saw the video from Avalon Grill. I've been looking into Whitmore Technologies for months. Please call me. Danielle closed her eyes briefly, then pressed the call button. Grace answered on the first ring. Miss Carter, thank you for calling back. Her voice was steady, clear, professional, but not cold. You said you wanted to talk about my father, Danielle replied. Yes, and about Lingua Bridge. Danielle's stomach tightened. How do you know that name? Because when Whitmore Technologies acquired them 3 years ago, there were quiet disputes about intellectual credit. Nothing public, nothing proven. But your father's name surfaced in internal memos. Silence stretched between them. Grace continued carefully. Tonight's video caught my attention because of your fluency. But that level of technical Mandarin doesn't come from a hobby. I did some digging. Your father, Marcus Carter, was listed in early development drafts for a multilingual AI engine that later became Whitmore's flagship product. Danielle's fingers tightened around the phone. And then? She asked softly. And then his name disappeared. The word hung heavy in the air. Danielle turned back to her laptop, scrolling slowly through the patent versions she had just uncovered. Grace spoke again, gentler now. I'm not calling to exploit you. I'm calling because if what I'm seeing is accurate, this isn't just about a viral restaurant moment. This is about intellectual erasure. Danielle swallowed. You think they stole his work? I think it's worth asking that question publicly. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly. My father signed contracts, Danielle said carefully. Consultant agreements. Consultants still retain attribution rights in many cases, Grace replied. Oh, especially in federally funded research partnerships. Danielle blinked. Federally funded? Yes. Whitmore Technologies received grant money tied to cross-cultural communication initiatives. That money required ethical implementation safeguards. Danielle's pulse quickened. Her father's journal had been filled with notes about ethical safeguards. You're saying there could be more than just his name missing? I'm saying, Grace answered. Grace. If those safeguards were removed after acquisition, that's not just business restructuring. That's a serious issue. Outside, a car alarm chirped and fell silent. Danielle leaned back in her chair. I don't have money for lawyers, she said quietly, and I don't want fame. I'm not offering fame, Grace said. I'm offering truth, and possibly accountability. Danielle thought of Richard on the balcony, the slight crack in his composure when she said lingua bridge, and she thought of her mother counting pills. She thought of her father bent over a laptop at 2 a.m., muttering about nuance and responsibility. What would you need? Danielle asked. Documentation, emails, drafts, anything that shows original authorship. Danielle glanced at the flash drive. I have something, she admitted. Good, Grace replied. Don't send it electronically yet. Now we'll meet in person. Why in person? Because powerful people don't like losing control of their narratives. The next afternoon, Danielle sat in a small coffee shop near Hyde Park, the kind with chipped wooden tables and handwritten menus taped to the wall. Snow flurries drifted past the front window like shaken confetti. Grace Lynn walked in precisely at 2 o'clock. She was in her late 30s, wearing a wool coat and carrying a leather satchel worn at the corners. And her eyes were observant, but not unkind. They shook hands. You look exactly like the video, Grace said with a small smile. You look like someone who doesn't sleep much, Danielle replied. Grace laughed softly. Occupational hazard. They sat. Danielle slid the flash drive across the table. Grace didn't open it immediately. Before we look at anything, she said, you need to understand something. If we move forward with this, there will be pushback. Mr. Whitmore has resources, public relations teams, legal departments. Danielle held her gaze. I've already lived through losing everything once. Grace nodded slowly. They plugged in the flash drive. On Grace's laptop screen, Marcus Carter's early drafts appeared, code annotated with handwritten notes about cultural bias mitigation, sections about protecting dialect diversity, memos questioning commercialization strategies. Grace scrolled in silence. This is substantial, she murmured, but her eyes stopped on one file. What's this? Danielle leaned closer. It was a recording. Her father's voice filled the small cafe speaker, low and thoughtful. If this technology is stripped of its ethical guardrails, it will become a tool of profit, not understanding. I won't support that direction. Grace's expression hardened. This changes everything, she said quietly. Outside the cafe, a black SUV idled longer than necessary before pulling away. Neither woman noticed. That evening, Richard Whitmore stood in his office on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Tower. The skyline stretched out beneath him like something owned. His assistant approached cautiously. Sir, media inquiries have increased since last night. There's also internal chatter about lingua bridge. Richard's jaw tightened. Contain it. Yes, sir. And Miss Carter? She met with a Tribune reporter this afternoon. Richard's fingers drummed against the glass. Prepare an invitation, he said slowly. Private dinner, my residence. For what purpose? To resolve a misunderstanding. He turned back toward the window. He had built his empire on control. He did not intend to lose it to a waitress with a flash drive. That night, Danielle returned home with a strange mixture of fear and clarity in her chest. Grace had promised discretion, but discretion didn't stop retaliation. Her mother looked up from the couch. "You're walking like someone who just stepped into a storm," she said gently. Danielle sat beside her. "I might have." Her mother studied her face. "Is it about that man from the restaurant?" "Yes." A pause. "You remember what your father used to say?" her mother asked. Danielle smiled faintly. "Truth connects, and lies divide," her mother finished. The radiator clanged again. Danielle looked around the small apartment, at the worn carpet, the peeling paint, at the stack of unpaid envelopes. For years, survival had been her only priority. Now something else was rising. Not anger, not revenge. Responsibility. Her phone buzzed once more. An email notification. From Whitmore Enterprises, subject line, invitation. She opened it. "Mr. Whitmore requests the pleasure of your presence at his Lake Forest residence tomorrow evening to discuss a mutually beneficial opportunity." Danielle stared at the screen. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, something steadied. He thought this was still about money. He didn't understand yet. This was about a name, and she wasn't backing down. Lake Forest sat quiet under a thin sheet of winter sunlight, its streets lined with sprawling estates tucked behind iron gates and manicured hedges. Danielle had taken the commuter train north, watching the city slowly thin into wide lawns and stone driveways. The contrast felt almost theatrical, like stepping from one America into another. Richard Whitmore's home stood at the end of a curved private drive, modern glass and limestone rising against bare oak trees. It didn't feel like a house. It felt like a statement. A security guard at the gate checked her name without expression. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished floors, abstract paintings that probably cost more than her childhood home, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a frozen stretch of Lake Michigan, gray and endless. And Richard waited in a sitting room framed by tall bookshelves and low leather chairs. He wore a charcoal sweater instead of a suit, but the authority still fit him like custom tailoring. "Miss Carter," he said evenly, "thank you for coming." Danielle kept her coat on. "You asked to speak?" "Yes." He gestured toward a seat. "Please." She sat, but not comfortably. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A fireplace crackled softly to their left. "I'm asking questions." "A dangerous habit," he said. "I've been meeting with reporters," Richard said finally. "I understand you've been meeting with reporters," Richard said finally. "I've been asking questions." "A dangerous habit," he replied calmly. "For whom?" He smiled faintly. "For people who don't understand scale." Danielle folded her hands in her lap. "My father understood scale. He understood responsibility." Richard's expression shifted barely. "Marcus Carter was a consultant," he said. "A talented one. He was compensated fairly. His name disappeared from the patent. That's standard consolidation during acquisition. He developed the core architecture." Richard stood and walked toward the window. Snow dusted the frozen shoreline below. "Miss Carter," he said without turning, "Lingua Bridge was struggling. We invested. We stabilized. We expanded. Without Whitmore Technologies, that engine would be sitting on a forgotten server somewhere." Danielle watched his reflection in the glass. "And in exchange," she said quietly, "you removed the ethical safeguards he built into it." He turned now. "That's speculation." "I heard his recordings." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Your father," he said, voice firmer now, "was idealistic. He believed technology should serve everyone equally. Admirable, but unrealistic." "Unprofitable?" Danielle asked. He studied her for a long moment. "You're intelligent," he said. You know the world doesn't operate on sentiment. And yet you invited me here." A pause. Richard crossed the room and opened a leather portfolio resting on the table. He slid a document toward her. An employment contract. Chief Cultural Consultant. Whitmore Global AI Division. Signing bonus, $1 million. Annual salary, more than she had ever imagined. Stock options. Beneath it, another document. Non-disclosure agreement. Non-disparagement clause. And one line in bold. Acknowledgement that all intellectual property associated with LinguaBridge rightfully belonged to Whitmore Technologies. Danielle read it slowly. "You're offering to buy silence," she said. "I'm offering partnership," he replied smoothly. "You have skill, presence. The public likes you. Join us. Help shape the narrative from inside." "By agreeing my father didn't build what he built?" Richard's tone sharpened. "By acknowledging legal reality." She looked up at him. "Oh, my father died believing he failed." Silence fell heavy in the room. Richard didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, "He failed to adapt." Danielle stood. "That's not the same thing." The fireplace crackled louder in the quiet. "You think this is about pride," she continued. "It's not. It's about truth." Richard's calm began to fracture at the edges. "Truth?" he repeated. "Truth is what survives documentation, contracts, signatures, boards of directors." "And erased names?" she asked. He stepped closer now. "You are one person," he said quietly. "I am an institution." She held his gaze. "You're a man." For a split second, something raw flickered across his face. He exhaled slowly and adjusted his tone. "You don't have the resources to fight this publicly. You'll be dragged through litigation for years. Your mother's medical history will become part of discovery. Your academic records scrutinized, and every comment you've ever made online dissected." He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. The threat was wrapped in civility. Danielle felt fear rise in her throat, but it did not take control. She reached into her coat pocket and placed her phone gently on the coffee table between them. The screen was dark. "Everything we've said is recorded," she said calmly. Richard froze. "Careful," he warned. "You invited me." He stared at her. You're making a mistake." "No," she said softly. "You did." She picked up the contract and slid it back toward him. "I don't want your money." Her voice did not shake. "I want my father's name back." For the first time since she'd known him, Richard Whitmore looked uncertain. Not angry, uncertain. He walked back toward the window again, shoulders rigid. "You're emotional," he said finally. "I'm patient." Snow began to fall heavier outside, softening the hard edges of the landscape, when Richard spoke without turning. "If this goes public, you may win a headline, but you'll lose peace." Danielle moved toward the door. "I already lost peace 3 years ago." She paused at the threshold. "You can still do the right thing," she added. He didn't answer. The train ride back to Chicago felt longer than the ride north. The sky had darkened to a bruised purple, city lights flickering on like distant signals. Her phone buzzed as the skyline came back into view. "Grace. How did it go?" Danielle looked out at the approaching city. "He tried to buy it," she said. Grace exhaled slowly. "That confirms motive. He thinks I don't have the resources." "Do you?" Danielle thought of the flash drive, the recordings, the federal grant details Grace had uncovered. "I have the truth." "That's enough to start," Grace replied. The train screeched into the station. As Danielle stepped onto the platform, cold air wrapping around her again, she felt something shift inside. Fear was still there, but it no longer felt paralyzing. It felt clarifying. Behind her, miles away, in a house of glass and stone, Richard Whitmore stood alone in front of his window, watching snow erase footprints from his driveway. For the first time in years, control felt slippery, and somewhere between South Side and Lake Forest, the balance of power had begun to tilt. The article dropped at 6:02 a.m. Danielle was still in her kitchen when her phone began vibrating across the counter like it had something urgent to confess. Outside, the early morning sky hung low and gray over Southside rooftops. The coffee maker hissed and sputtered beside her, filling the apartment with the faint smell of something strong enough to wake the dead. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone. Grace Lynn had texted only 2 words. "It's live." Danielle opened the link, and the headline filled the screen. "Inside Whitmore's AI Empire, the Erased Architect." Below it, her father's name, Marcus Carter. Not as a footnote, not as a consultant, as the original designer of LinguaBridge's foundational algorithm. The article was careful. It wasn't loud. Grace had written it like a slow, tightening drumbeat. Timeline documents, acquisition records, internal memos, federal grant stipulations, excerpts from Marcus's recorded warnings about ethical safeguards. And then, as midway through, the audio clip from Richard's living room. "If this goes public, you may win a headline, but you'll lose peace." The quote sat there in black and white, stripped of tone, stripped of control. Danielle read it twice. Her mother stepped into the kitchen, robe wrapped tight against the morning chill. "What is it?" she asked softly. Danielle turned the phone toward her. For a long moment, her mother said nothing. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read Marcus Carter's name displayed in bold. "He would have hated the spotlight," her mother whispered. "But he would have hated being erased more," Danielle replied. By 8 a.m., cable news segments began referencing the article. By 9, financial analysts were discussing Whitmore Technologies' potential exposure to federal review. By 10, hashtags trended nationwide. Hashtag Justice for Marcus. Hashtag Whitmore Exposed. Hashtag Language Isa. Bridge Danielle stood at the bus stop again, and from 2 days earlier spotted her. "Yo, that's her," one whispered. This time the tone wasn't mockery, it was respect. At the Avalon Grill, the mood had shifted dramatically. Staff gathered around a small TV in the break room, watching as a legal correspondent dissected the implications of misused development funds. As Lillian spotted Danielle near the lockers. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so." "You don't have to work tonight," Lillian offered. Danielle shook her head. "Yes, I do." Because she needed the paycheck. Because dignity didn't pay rent. Because kindness didn't pause for headlines. The lunch crowd was thinner than usual. A few regulars approached Danielle quietly to say they admired her courage. Others stared with open curiosity. Around noon, Richard Whitmore appeared on the television above the bar. He stood behind a podium in front of a white backdrop bearing his company's logo. His suit was immaculate, his posture controlled. "Whitmore Technologies has always operated within legal and ethical boundaries," he stated evenly. "Recent allegations are based on misinterpretations of complex contractual arrangements." He did not mention Marcus Carter by name. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge Danielle. But when a reporter asked whether the company had removed ethical safeguards from the original LinguaBridge framework, his pause lasted half a second too long. The stock ticker crawled along the bottom of the screen. Whitmore Technologies down 14%. In his glass tower office, Richard watched the same broadcast replayed on 3 different monitors. His legal counsel stood beside him, whispering options: defamation claims, intellectual property defenses, strategic settlements. Richard's phone buzzed incessantly with board members demanding reassurance. He silenced it. For the first time, the room felt smaller. That evening, Danielle returned home to find Grace waiting on the front steps of her building, coat collar pulled high against the wind. I wanted to see how you were holding up, Grace said. Danielle unlocked the door and let her inside. The apartment felt warmer than usual, crowded with purpose. They're launching a formal review, Grace said once they sat at the kitchen table. Federal Oversight Committee, because the grants tied to LinguaBridge included humanitarian implementation clauses. Danielle absorbed that slowly. So it's bigger than his name. Yes, Grace said. It's about whether Whitmore repurposed technology intended for refugee communication services into proprietary licensing structures. Danielle let out a long breath. Revenge, she said. No. You did it for revenge, she said. No. You did it for accuracy. For dignity. Grace nodded. Good. Hold on to that. There was a knock at the door. Danielle stiffened. Mrs. Alvarez from upstairs stood in the hallway, holding a small casserole dish wrapped in foil. I saw the news, she said warmly. Your father would be proud. Danielle accepted the dish, throat tight. After Mrs. Alvarez left, Danielle leaned against the door for a moment. This wasn't fame. This wasn't spectacle. It was community. It was people remembering who she had always been. Her phone buzzed again. An email from Northwestern University. Subject line, recognition. She opened it slowly. Yes, the linguistics department wished to formally acknowledge Marcus Carter's contribution to early AI translation studies and invited Danielle to speak at an upcoming symposium. Her knees weakened slightly as she sat back down. They're restoring him, she whispered. Grace smiled. They're starting to. Across the city, Whitmore Technologies board convened an emergency meeting. Investors questioned the optics. Legal teams debated strategy. But Richard remained composed in the conference room, but his fingers tapped rhythmically against polished wood. One board member spoke bluntly. If this escalates into a federal fraud investigation, we cannot protect you. Richard's jaw tightened. I built this company, and now it's tied to a story about erasing a black engineer's name, the board member replied. Public perception matters. For years, Richard had controlled narratives, as now the narrative had slipped into someone else's hands. That night, Danielle sat at the small desk by her window, the city glowing faintly beyond cracked glass. She opened her father's leather journal again. On the last page, in neat handwriting, he had written, Integrity is not a strategy, it's a foundation. She traced the words slowly. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, as they always did. Life continued. Her mother's breathing steadied in the bedroom, while the radiator clanged again. Danielle felt something settle inside her. Not triumph, not vengeance. Relief. But she knew the storm wasn't finished. Because truth, once spoken, doesn't simply correct the past. It reshapes the future. And tomorrow, that reshaping would begin in a room full of lawyers. The federal building on Dearborn Street rose like a block of cold marble against the winter sky. Its tall windows reflected a pale sun that offered light but no warmth. Where Danielle stood at the base of the steps, coat buttoned tight, her father's worn leather journal tucked under her arm. People moved past her in suits and long wool coats, briefcases swinging with quiet urgency. No one knew she had once walked into a rooftop restaurant and been laughed at for speaking a language they assumed she didn't belong in. Today, she walked into a building where laughter had no place. Grace met her inside the lobby. You ready? She asked. Danielle nodded. Oh, as ready as someone can be to reopen old wounds. Security scanned her bag. The metal detector hummed faintly. The hallway beyond smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. The review panel was not a courtroom, but it felt like one. A long rectangular table, federal oversight members seated in a row, a stenographer in the corner, representatives from Whitmore Technologies on the opposite side. Richard Whitmore sat at the center of his legal team, not expression composed but thinner than usual, like someone who hadn't slept much. Danielle took her seat across from him. For a brief second, their eyes met. There was no smile, only calculation. The chair of the Oversight Committee began. This review concerns the acquisition and modification of federally funded linguistic AI technologies and the potential removal of required ethical safeguards. We will hear statements from both parties. Whitmore's lead attorney stood first. He spoke in careful, layered language about contractual transfers, corporate restructuring, and compliance protocols. He emphasized legal ownership. He referenced signed agreements. He did not mention Marcus Carter. Then it was Danielle's turn. She stood slowly. Her hands were steady. My father believed language connects people who would otherwise never understand one another, she began. He believed technology should widen that bridge, not narrow it. The room quieted. She opened the journal. These notes are dated 2 years before LinguaBridge was acquired. They include architectural models identical to those currently patented under Whitmore Technologies. She placed printed comparisons on the table. Grace had helped prepare them. Side-by-side algorithm structures. Identical. A murmur rippled through the room. Danielle continued. After acquisition, the humanitarian deployment safeguards he built in were removed. Those safeguards were required under the federal grant issued to LinguaBridge. One oversight member leaned forward. Do you have documentation of those safeguards? Danielle pressed play on her phone. Her father's recorded voice filled the room once more. If this technology is stripped of its ethical guardrails, it will become a tool of profit, not understanding. The silence afterward felt heavier than anything spoken. Richard's attorney rose quickly. These recordings are personal reflections, not legal documents. But the chair of the committee spoke calmly. They are evidence of original design intent, and they correlate with pre-acquisition grant conditions. Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time, Danielle saw something shift in him. Not anger. Pressure. The hearing stretched for hours. Questions, clarifications, contract language dissected. At one point, Richard himself stood. Whitmore Technologies did not erase Mr. Removing his name? An oversight member removing his name? An oversight member asked. Richard paused. We followed standard industry practices. Danielle watched him carefully. Standard. The word sounded small in that room. When the session adjourned for recess, Danielle stepped into the hallway, heart pounding harder than she let anyone see. Grace approached quietly. You did well. Danielle exhaled. I didn't come here to do well. No, Grace said. You came here to be accurate. Inside the chamber, Whitmore's legal team conferred urgently. Papers shuffled, phones vibrated. By late afternoon, the oversight chair returned with preliminary findings. Based on documentation presented today, she said, the committee finds sufficient cause to open a formal federal investigation into the modification of grant-protected safeguards and intellectual attribution procedures. The words landed slowly. Formal investigation. Not a headline. Not a trend. A process. Danielle felt something inside her release. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to breathe deeper. The chair continued. Pending investigation. Whitmore Technologies will suspend deployment expansion of LinguaBridge and provide full documentation of acquisition records. Richard's face remained composed, but his fingers, resting on the table, had stopped tapping. Outside the building, cameras waited. Reporters clustered near the steps. Grace guided Danielle toward the side exit. You don't owe them a performance, she said, but one reporter spotted her. Miss Carter? Do you feel vindicated? Danielle paused. Vindicated. Yet it wasn't the word she would have chosen. I feel heard, she said simply. And what do you want now? Another asked. She looked up at the winter sky. "My father's name restored," she replied. "Nothing more." That evening, news channels shifted tone. This was no longer a viral moment. It was a developing federal inquiry. Stock markets reacted again. Whitmore Technologies fell another 9%. In the glass tower downtown, Richard stood alone in his office long after sunset. The city lights flickered beneath him like distant warnings. His assistant entered cautiously. "The board has scheduled an emergency vote tomorrow morning." Richard didn't turn. "They won't remove me," he said quietly. "They're under pressure." He closed his eyes briefly. For years, he had navigated crises through strategy. But this felt different. This wasn't about numbers. It was about narrative. And for the first time, he wasn't controlling it. Back on South Side, Danielle sat at her small kitchen table once more. Her mother placed a hand over hers. "You stood up for him," she said. Danielle nodded. "I stood up for what he stood for." Her phone buzzed again. A message from Northwestern. The symposium invitation had expanded. They would formally review Marcus Carter's original contributions with the university's archival board. Outside, snow fell again, soft, quiet, covering sidewalks and rooftops in white. Now the neighborhood looked different under snow, cleaner, hopeful. Danielle stepped to the window and watched flakes drift past the streetlight. For the first time since the rooftop challenge, she felt something beyond tension. Possibility. The investigation would take time. The board vote would bring consequences. But something irreversible had already happened. A name once erased had been spoken again in rooms where it mattered. And once spoken, it could not easily be silenced. Tomorrow, the board would decide Richard Whitmore's fate. But tonight, in a small apartment on the South Side, a daughter finally felt her father's legacy breathe again. Morning came sharp and bright, sunlight bouncing off fresh snow and pouring through Danielle's thin curtains like something urgent. The radiator clanked in protest, then fell quiet. Her phone was already alive. News alerts, financial updates, social media tags. Whitmore Technologies board convenes emergency session. Now she sat up slowly, heart steady but heavy. Her mother watched her from the doorway. "You don't have to look," she said gently. "I do," Danielle replied, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about consequence. At 9:13 a.m., the announcement came. Richard Whitmore had stepped down as CEO pending investigation. The wording was careful. Voluntary leave of absence. Temporary transition of leadership. But the meaning was unmistakable. That the man who had once laughed from a rooftop balcony was no longer untouchable. Danielle didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled. Her father's name had begun to tip a system. By afternoon, Grace called again. "They're negotiating," she said, quietly. "About what?" "Intellectual attribution, financial restitution, public acknowledgement." Danielle closed her eyes briefly. "How quiet?" "Behind closed doors," Grace answered. "They don't want a drawn-out trial." Do you think?" Grace paused. "I think they want this resolved." "Yes." "And what do you think?" Grace paused. "I think they underestimated you." 2 days later, Danielle was summoned again. This time not to a federal building, but to a neutral conference center downtown. Snow had melted into gray slush along Michigan Avenue. The city felt restless, waiting. Inside a quiet boardroom, representatives from Whitmore Technologies sat on one side of a polished table. Richard was there, but he no longer sat at the center. He looked thinner somehow, not physically, but structurally, like the scaffolding beneath him had shifted. A senior board member spoke first. "Miss Carter, after internal review and in light of the federal inquiry, Whitmore Technologies is prepared to formally restore Marcus Carter's authorship credit to the Lingua Bridge patent. The words hung in the air. Restore, authorship, credit. Danielle did not interrupt. The board member continued. We will also allocate a scholarship fund in his name, supporting underrepresented students in computational linguistics. Richard remained silent. And, the board member added carefully, financial compensation equivalent to retroactive licensing royalties will be provided to the Carter estate. Danielle looked down at the folder in front of her. The numbers were substantial, but more than enough to change her life. To move out of South Side, to secure her mother's medical care, to finish school without debt. Richard finally spoke. This is not an admission of wrongdoing, he said, voice controlled but tight. It is a correction of oversight. Danielle met his eyes. An oversight that lasted 3 years. A faint flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps pride, passed across his face. You forced accountability, he said quietly. I asked for accuracy. Silence settled again. The board member pushed a pen toward her. You may review the documents. Danielle read every line. Marcus Carter would be listed as co-architect in all future publications and software documentation. His original ethical safeguards would be reinstated in humanitarian deployments. The scholarship would be administered independently. Her fingers rested lightly on the final page. For a moment, she thought of that rooftop night, the laughter, the challenge, the assumption. Then she thought of her father bent over his desk, whispering about bridges. She signed, not because she wanted money, but because this paper restored truth in a system that had buried it. Richard watched her sign. Something in his posture shifted. Not collapse, not surrender. Recognition. Outside the conference center, cameras waited again. This time, Danielle stepped forward. Not because she was chased, but because she chose to speak. My father's name has been restored, she said calmly into a cluster of microphones. That matters more than anything else. Are you satisfied? A reporter asked. Satisfied isn't the right word, she replied. I'm grateful that truth still carries weight. And Mr. Whitmore? She paused. I hope he remembers that leadership isn't about control, she said. It's about responsibility. Across the street, in a black sedan idling at the curb, Richard watched the broadcast replay on his phone. For the first time, he didn't look angry. He looked reflective. Weeks passed. Whitmore Technologies reinstated the ethical safeguards Marcus had designed. International humanitarian groups publicly acknowledged the corrections. Northwestern University held a formal symposium honoring Marcus Carter's contributions. Danielle stood at the podium in an auditorium filled with students and faculty. Behind her, not a slide displayed her father's photograph. Not forgotten, not erased, recognized. She spoke about language not as power, but as connection. About how bridges must be maintained, not monetized. Afterward, an elderly professor approached her. Your father was brilliant, he said softly. We should have protected him better. Danielle smiled gently. You're protecting him now. With the compensation funds, Danielle paid off her mother's medical debt first. Then she did something unexpected. She returned to Avalon Grill. The restaurant had changed ownership after the controversy. Mrs. Lillian greeted her with open arms. I heard, she said proudly. Danielle looked around at the dining room where it had all begun. I'd like to rent the upstairs space once a week, she said. For what? Language classes, Danielle replied. Free for kids in the neighborhood. Mrs. Lillian didn't hesitate. It's yours. And on a Tuesday evening in early spring, the upstairs dining room filled with folding chairs and second-hand textbooks. Children from 12 different backgrounds sat in a circle. Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Polish, Yoruba. Danielle began class by writing 3 words on the board. Language is bridge. The room echoed with accents and laughter, but not mocking laughter, learning laughter. Across the city, Richard Whitmore sat alone in his now smaller office, reading a press release about the Marcus Carter Scholarship. He reached for his phone and made a quiet donation to the fund. Anonymous. It wasn't redemption, but it was recognition. One afternoon, as Danielle finished class, her phone buzzed again. An official letter from Northwestern. She had been awarded a full scholarship to complete her master's degree in computational linguistics, named the Marcus Carter Fellowship. She stood in the empty dining room, to sunlight slanting across polished wood, and let the moment settle. This wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about headlines. It was about a name carried forward. That night, she stood on a small pedestrian bridge overlooking the Chicago River. The water shimmered under city lights, flowing steady and unbothered by the noise above. "We didn't lose, Dad," she whispered. Behind her, traffic moved. Ahead of her, lights stretched into distance. A bridge held firm between 2 shores, and this time, now it bore her father's name. Spring arrived slowly in Chicago, as if the city needed convincing. Snow receded into narrow gray ridges along sidewalks. The river shifted from steel to deep green. Buds formed stubbornly on branches that had endured too much wind. Danielle walked across the pedestrian bridge again one morning, sunlight touching the water in scattered flashes. This time, she wasn't alone in her thoughts. No, she carried a folder under her arm, Northwestern's official fellowship documents, embossed with gold lettering that caught the light. Marcus Carter Fellowship. She ran her fingers over the raised letters as if they might disappear if she didn't. They didn't. At Avalon Grill's upstairs room, folding chairs were no longer mismatched. Donations had arrived quietly, used desks, language textbooks, a small whiteboard on wheels. Parents dropped their children off with shy smiles and hopeful eyes. "Miss Carter?" a little girl with braids asked one afternoon. "How many languages do you know?" Danielle smiled. "Enough to listen," she replied. The class laughed softly. Listening. That was what her father had believed mattered most. Outside the windows, traffic moved along Wacker Drive. Inside, 12 children practiced greeting one another in different languages. English blending into Mandarin, into Spanish, into Arabic, into Yoruba. No one laughed at the accents. No one assumed who belonged where. Language became something soft and shared. Not a weapon, not a spectacle. Across town, Whitmore Technologies held its annual shareholder meeting without Richard at the helm. The new interim CEO stood behind the podium, speaking carefully about transparency reforms and ethical review committees. In the front row, Richard sat quietly, no longer center stage. Cameras no longer followed him the way they once had. His name still carried weight, but not control. When the Marcus Carter Scholarship Fund was formally announced, a video tribute played on the large screen behind the board. Archival images of Marcus coding late at night. Excerpts from his journals about bridging cultures. The room fell quiet. Richard watched the footage with a stillness that surprised even him. He had once viewed Marcus Carter as a brilliant but inconvenient idealist. Now he saw something else. A man who had been right too early. After the meeting, Richard approached the new CEO privately. "Make sure the safeguards stay," he said quietly. "They will," the CEO replied. Richard nodded once and left the building without addressing reporters. It wasn't redemption, but it was change. Danielle's mother began walking farther each day as spring warmed the sidewalks. With medical bills paid and treatment stabilized, she carried herself lighter, less burdened by worry. "You could move," her mother suggested one evening over dinner. "Oh, a nicer neighborhood. A bigger place." Danielle considered it. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Alvarez watering plants on the fire escape, kids playing basketball in the alley, the corner store owner sweeping dust from his doorway. "I like it here," Danielle said softly, because this was where the bridge had begun. She did, however, use part of the restitution to renovate the upstairs classroom space. Fresh paint, better lighting, a row of donated laptops. One evening, Grace Lynn stopped by to observe a class. "You've turned a viral moment into a movement," Grace said quietly. Danielle shook her head. "No," she replied. "I turned an insult into intention." Grace smiled. "You know this story will follow you." "I hope so," Danielle answered. "As long as it reminds people to look twice before they laugh." Northwestern's campus bloomed in early May. Tulips lined the walkways. Students sprawled across the grass with laptops and textbooks. Well, when Danielle stepped into her first graduate seminar under the Marcus Carter Fellowship, she paused at the doorway. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk and old wood. Her professor looked up. "Ms. Carter," he said warmly, "we're honored to have you back." Back, the word held weight. She took a seat near the window. As the lecture began, she listened, not just to the content, but to the cadence of ideas passing between people who cared about language deeply. Oh, she felt something settle into place. This wasn't a return. It was a continuation. One afternoon, as Danielle walked across campus, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. "Miss Carter?" "Yes?" "This is Richard Whitmore." She stopped walking. Students moved around her, unaware. "I won't take much of your time," he continued. His voice sounded different, less polished, more measured. "I wanted to say, I underestimated you." Danielle didn't respond immediately. "I also underestimated your father," he added. A breeze rustled through the trees overhead. "What do you want from me?" she asked calmly. "Nothing," he replied. "Just to acknowledge that your persistence changed more than a patent." She considered that. "My father believed in building bridges," she said. "You tried to widen them without guardrails." There was a pause. "You were right to push," he admitted. I was right to listen," she corrected gently. Silence stretched between them, but not hostile. "I hope you use the scholarship wisely," he said finally. "I already am." They ended the call without farewell. It wasn't forgiveness. It was closure. Summer approached, bringing warm air and open windows to the South Side apartment. The upstairs classroom at Avalon Grill expanded to 2 nights a week. Volunteers joined, college students, retired teachers, parents. As a mural appeared on the outside brick wall of the restaurant, a painted bridge stretching between 2 skylines, Marcus Carter's name etched along its arch. Neighbors gathered for its unveiling. Danielle stood at the front, microphone in hand. Children clustered beside her. "This bridge," she said simply, "belongs to everyone who chooses to listen before they judge." Applause rose. Not loud, not flashy. Sincere. As the sun dipped behind city buildings, golden light washed over the mural. While Danielle looked at the children gathered there, faces bright, eyes curious. Once in a rooftop restaurant, someone had tried to reduce her to a punchline. Now, she stood at the center of something stronger than laughter. A legacy, not of wealth, not of power, but of restoration. The river continued flowing through Chicago, steady and indifferent to headlines. Bridges held firm above it, carrying cars, trains, pedestrians, carrying stories. Danielle walked home that evening past familiar streets, feeling the quiet weight of fulfillment. She hadn't set out to change the world. She had only refused to let a name be erased. Sometimes that was enough. And somewhere in the city, in offices and classrooms and small apartments, people spoke Marcus Carter's name without hesitation. Not because of scandal, but because of truth. The bridge stood, and it would stand long after the laughter faded. While autumn returned to Chicago with a different kind of light, golden, steady, forgiving. The trees along the river shifted from green to amber, and the wind carried that crisp edge that made people walk a little faster, speak a little softer. Danielle stood at the front of her classroom on a Saturday morning, sunlight streaming through tall windows and landing in warm squares across the floor. 12 children sat in a circle again, but now there were more. Parents lingered in the hallway. Volunteers had doubled. On the whiteboard behind her, she had written in careful script, "Language is a bridge." "Who can tell me what that means?" she asked. A boy in the back raised his hand. "It means you can cross into someone else's world." Danielle smiled. "Yes," she said. "And sometimes, someone can cross into yours." Outside, traffic hummed along the street. Somewhere nearby, a train rattled across steel tracks. The city was alive in its usual way, busy, imperfect, loud. But inside that room, something quiet and intentional was growing. Later that afternoon, Danielle walked across campus at Northwestern again. The fellowship had settled into routine. Lectures, research proposals, late-night study sessions with classmates who now knew her not as a viral headline, but as a colleague. Her research focused on equitable language modeling, ensuring dialects weren't erased in data training. It felt like finishing a sentence her father had started. Once in the library's digital archive room, she accessed newly restored files under Marcus Carter's name. The university had officially updated its internal records to reflect his co-authorship on foundational AI translation models. Seeing his name in institutional print, no asterisk, no qualifier, felt different from the media coverage. This wasn't a correction under pressure. It was acknowledgement. Her phone buzzed lightly in her pocket. An unknown number again. Now she stepped into a quiet hallway before answering. "Miss Carter?" the voice asked. "Yes. This is Daniel Price from the United Nations Cultural Technology Initiative. We're reviewing updated ethical frameworks in translation AI. Your father's work has become central to our revisions." Danielle leaned against the wall, heart steady. "That's good to hear. We'd like to invite you to present at our Geneva summit this winter, about your father's safeguards and how they were reinstated." For a moment, she closed her eyes. From Southside apartment, to federal hearing, to international summit. "All right," she said softly. "I'll be there." Across town, Whitmore Technologies released its quarterly report. The company had stabilized, not because of aggressive expansion, but because of transparency reforms. Ethical oversight boards had been established, deployment protocols revised, while Richard Whitmore now held an advisory position. No longer CEO, no longer the face of the empire he had built. He spent more time out of the spotlight. One afternoon, he visited the Avalon Grill quietly. No press, no announcement. Mrs. Lillian recognized him immediately. "You're not here for dinner," she said plainly. "No," he admitted. Danielle was upstairs finishing class when Lillian called her down. She walked into the dining room slowly. Richard stood near the mural painted along the exterior wall, visible through the window. The bridge arched in bright colors across brick. He studied it for a long moment before turning toward her. "I didn't expect this," he said quietly. Danielle folded her arms gently. "What did you expect?" "A lawsuit," he replied honestly. "A drawn-out battle." She considered that. "I didn't want to win against you," she said. "I wanted to correct something." He nodded. "I've been reviewing internal reports," he said. "The safeguards your father insisted on. They're preventing misuse in refugee camps overseas. I didn't fully understand the scope before." Danielle didn't respond immediately. "You see it now," she said finally. "Yes." Silence stretched between them, but not tense. Richard glanced toward the staircase where children's voices drifted down faintly. "You built something here," he said. "We built it," she corrected. The community did." He reached into his coat pocket and placed an envelope on the table. "I'd like to contribute to the language program," he said. "No publicity, no conditions." Danielle looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "This isn't about clearing your conscience," she said carefully. "I know," he replied. "It's about continuing something that should have been protected from the start." After a long pause, she nodded once. "All right," she said. "But it stays anonymous." He gave a faint smile. "Of course." When he left, he didn't look back at the cameras outside. There were none waiting. Just the quiet hum of a city moving forward. Winter arrived early that year. Geneva felt colder than Chicago in December, though the lake there lay calmer than the river back home. Danielle stood at a podium in a large conference hall, flags lining the walls behind her. Delegates from dozens of countries filled the room. Now she spoke about linguistic equity, not as theory, but as lived experience, about how technology must protect the dignity of those it serves. She told them about Marcus Carter, not as a victim, as a visionary. And when his name was removed, she said calmly, something essential was weakened. Not just a person's credit, but a principle. The room listened. When she finished, applause rose, not explosive but sustained. Afterward, a delegate from Kenya approached her. Your father's safeguards have already improved our refugee translation systems," he said. "You carried his bridge across an ocean." Danielle felt her throat tighten. "I didn't carry it alone," she replied. Months later, back in Chicago, the Marcus Carter Fellowship expanded into a permanent endowed program at Northwestern. Danielle completed her master's degree under her father's name. At graduation, she wore her cap and gown with quiet pride. Her mother sat in the audience, with tears shining openly. When Danielle's name was called, she walked across the stage with steady steps. Not because she had been offered $100,000 to prove something, but because she had refused to let laughter define her. After the ceremony, she walked once more to the pedestrian bridge over the river. Spring had returned again. Boats drifted below. Tourists leaned over rails taking photos, while she stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the city skyline, the glass towers, the old brick buildings, the spaces between them. The world was still imperfect. There would be other erasures, other assumptions, other laughter. But she had learned something enduring. Bridges are not built by power. They are built by persistence. Her phone buzzed softly, a text from one of her students. "Ms. Carter, I got into college." She smiled. "Language is a bridge. And somewhere in Chicago, in a classroom above a restaurant, in a university archive, in a federal document, and in an international policy paper, Marcus Carter's name stood firm. Not because a millionaire had challenged his daughter, but because she answered. And once she did, the world listened. Summer settled over Chicago in layers of heat and movement. Street vendors called out from corners, buses exhaled at every stop, and the river reflected sunlight like a restless mirror. Danielle no longer walked through the city unnoticed, not in the celebrity sense. The headlines had faded, news cycles had shifted, but in subtle ways, nods from strangers, invitations to speak, emails from teachers across the country asking for curriculum outlines. Her voice had found its place. The classroom above Avalon Grill had grown too small. On a humid Tuesday evening, folding chairs filled every corner of the upstairs space. Kids squeezed shoulder to shoulder. In notebooks balanced on knees, parents stood in the doorway, fanning themselves with flyers. Danielle stood at the front, looking out at faces that represented more countries than she could count. "I think we need a bigger bridge," she said with a smile. Laughter rippled. Not mocking laughter. Shared laughter. Mrs. Lillian approached her afterward with an idea. "The community center 2 blocks down? It's been empty for years. City's been looking for someone to revive it." Danielle paused. "Und revive." The word carried weight. 2 months later, the Brooks Community Hall reopened under fresh paint and new lights. The name wasn't just a nod to her mother's family. It was a declaration that stories from South Side deserved preservation. The grand reopening wasn't glamorous. No ribbon-cutting ceremony with flashbulbs. Just neighbors bringing folding tables, kids running through freshly mopped hallways, volunteers hanging bilingual signs. Language classes expanded into mentorship programs, homework tutoring, cultural exchange nights where families brought food from home and told stories in 2 or 3 languages at once. One evening, as Danielle arranged chairs for a discussion circle, she overheard 2 teenagers talking near the doorway. "That's the woman from the $100,000 challenge," one whispered. "Yeah," the other said. "She didn't even take the money." Danielle pretended not to hear, because they were only half right. She had taken something far more valuable, her father's name, and she had turned it into a foundation. Whitmore. Technologies continued operating, quieter now, more cautious. The scholarship fund grew steadily. Each year, 2 new students from underrepresented communities entered computational linguistics under the Marcus Carter Scholarship. Richard Whitmore attended the second year's award ceremony, not as keynote speaker, but seated among the audience. When he watched as a young woman from Detroit accepted the scholarship, her voice trembled as she thanked the Carter family for fighting for fairness in technology. Richard's hands remained folded in his lap. He did not seek the stage. Afterward, he approached Danielle in the hallway. "You built something enduring," he said. "We built something accountable," she replied. He nodded once. "I thought power meant never losing control," he admitted quietly. "Turns out that it meant knowing when to let it shift." Danielle studied him. "You didn't lose everything," she said. "No," he answered. "Just the illusion." There was no bitterness in his tone, just honesty. Autumn returned again, leaves tumbling down sidewalks in copper swirls. The Brooks Community Hall hosted its first annual Bridge Festival. Children performed short skits in different languages. Elderly neighbors shared migration stories. A local jazz band played beneath strings of soft lights. While Danielle stood near the back, watching it all unfold. Grace Lynn stood beside her. "You know," Grace said, "the original video still gets replayed sometimes." Danielle smiled faintly. "Let it." Grace glanced at her. "You're not angry anymore." Danielle considered that. "I was never angry about the money," she said. "I was hurt about the assumption." "And now?" "Now," Danielle replied, "I see how small that assumption was." On stage, a little boy recited a poem in Mandarin and English, and his voice wavered at first, then strengthened. The crowd applauded. Danielle felt something settle inside her, something beyond victory. Peace. Later that night, she walked once more toward the pedestrian bridge. The air carried a hint of winter again. The city lights reflected on the water, stretching into shimmering lines. She stopped at the center and leaned against the railing. From this angle, the skyline no longer felt divided, glass towers and brick neighborhoods blending into one horizon. Her phone buzzed. A message from Northwestern's dean. The university planned to name a new interdisciplinary ethics lab after Marcus Carter. Permanent, not as a correction, as a legacy. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. She could almost hear her father's voice, gentle, patient, reminding her that integrity was not strategy, it was foundation. Behind her, footsteps approached, and it was one of her students, a teenager who had stayed late to help clean up. "Ms. Carter," he said, catching his breath, "I just wanted to tell you something." "Yes?" "I used to think people like us didn't get heard, but you proved we can." Danielle looked at him carefully. "I didn't prove that," she said softly. "I just answered when someone challenged me." He nodded. "That's enough." After he left, she stood there alone again. Once, under golden rooftop lights, a millionaire had laughed and offered money as spectacle. Now, the echo of that moment felt distant, because the real transformation hadn't been financial. It had been relational. A daughter refusing to shrink, a community stepping forward, a system adjusting under pressure. The river flowed beneath her, steady and unconcerned with applause. Bridges above it carried strangers toward destinations they didn't yet understand. While Danielle breathed in the cold night air and whispered into the quiet, "We didn't lose, Dad." The wind carried her words across the water, and somewhere in Chicago, inside classrooms, corporate policies, community halls, and quiet hearts, the bridge held firm. Not because someone laughed, but because someone listened and answered. The first frost of November crept quietly over Chicago, settling into the edges of rooftops and the corners of sidewalks like something patient. Out the Brooks Community Hall glowed from the inside, warm light spilling onto the pavement as evening classes began. Danielle stood near the doorway, greeting families one by one. The hall no longer felt temporary. It had rhythm now. Mondays for tutoring, Wednesdays for language exchange, Fridays for open discussions where neighbors shared stories that had once felt too small to matter. Inside, the mural of the bridge had been recreated along the main wall, brighter, larger, he stretching from one side of the room to the other. Beneath it, painted in careful letters, "Language is a bridge. Integrity is its foundation." A boy tugged gently at Danielle's sleeve. "Ms. Carter," he said, "my mom wants to sign up for the computer class too." Danielle smiled. "Bring her tomorrow night," she replied. "We'll make room." Because they always did. Northwestern's Ethics and Language Lab officially opened that same week. With the plaque outside the door read, "Marcus Carter Center for Ethical Language Technology." The ceremony was modest but meaningful. Professors spoke about responsibility and artificial intelligence. Students presented early research on bias mitigation. Danielle stood quietly near the back, hands folded, listening as her father's name was spoken in academic context, without hesitation, without correction. A faculty member approached her after the ribbon was cut. "Oh, you changed our department," he said. Danielle shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "You chose to correct it." He considered that. "Correction takes courage," he said. Outside, leaves skittered across the pavement in wind gusts. The lake beyond campus looked calm but cold. Danielle walked down to the shoreline alone for a moment. Years ago, she had stood in another place, beneath golden lights and laughter, being tested like a novelty. Now, the test felt different. Well, not of her worth, but of her stewardship. How would she carry this forward? Whitmore Technology's annual ethics report featured a new section that year, dedicated entirely to attribution standards and humanitarian deployment guidelines. Marcus Carter's safeguards were cited by name. Richard Whitmore read the report late one evening in his apartment overlooking downtown. The glass tower he once commanded now stood as part of the skyline rather than its center. He turned a page slowly. There, under a heading about implementation accountability, was a sentence he recognized. "Integrity is not a strategy, it is a foundation." He closed the report and leaned back in his chair. Control had once been his measure of success. Now, transparency defined his company's survival. He reached for his phone and sent a quiet message to Danielle. The safeguards were expanded today. International rollout complete. Her reply came minutes later. That's good. Nothing more. No triumph. No bitterness. Just acknowledgement. Winter deepened. Snow returned heavier than before, blanketing streets in thick white silence. Brooks Community Hall remained open despite it, heaters humming against cold windows. One evening, the power flickered during class. The room dimmed briefly before backup lights clicked on. Children gasped, then laughed nervously. Danielle raised her voice gently. "All right," she said. "What's the word for light in Spanish?" "Luz," a girl shouted. In Mandarin?" "Guang." "In Arabic?" "Nur." The room filled with words for illumination, layered over one another in warmth. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, light remained. After class, as parents bundled children into coats, an elderly man approached Danielle. He had attended the open discussion nights, but rarely spoke. "I came here from Poland 30 years ago," he said quietly. "I used to hide my accent. Tonight I told my story in Polish and English." Danielle listened. "Oh, no one laughed," he added. "No one should," she replied. He nodded once and left. Sometimes change didn't roar. It whispered. As the year drew toward its end, Danielle stood once more on the pedestrian bridge over the river. The water moved slower in winter, dark and steady beneath steel supports. Tourists were fewer now, the city quieter. She looked toward the skyline, the glass tower where Richard had once stood, from the university buildings where her father's name now rested in permanence, the neighborhood streets where children recited poetry in languages once mocked. Her phone buzzed again. A photo from one of her students, a college acceptance letter. Another text followed. "Ms. Carter, I'm applying for the Marcus Carter Scholarship." Danielle felt a quiet ache in her chest. Not sadness. Gratitude. Years ago, someone had laughed and held up money as a test. Now, how students held up applications as possibility. The bridge had become more than restoration. It had become direction. She leaned against the railing and watched snowflakes dissolve into the river. The city would continue testing people, by accent, by background, by assumption. But she had learned something steady. You don't need to shout to answer. You don't need wealth to shift a system. You only need clarity about what cannot be erased. Behind her, footsteps crossed the bridge, on strangers heading toward different parts of the city. Ahead of her, lights shimmered in the water's surface. The laughter from that rooftop night had long faded. In its place stood something quieter and stronger. A daughter who answered. A community that listened. A name restored. And a bridge that would carry more than one story across it. Danielle turned and walked back toward the warmth of the neighborhood, snow crunching beneath her boots. The work was not finished, but it was steady. And this time, the foundation would hold. If this story moved you, even a little, leave a simple comment below. Type 1 if you believe integrity always wins in the end. Type 0 if you think the world still needs more bridges like this. No long speeches, just a number. I read them. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about dignity, courage, and quiet strength, make sure you subscribe. Because there are more journeys ahead, but more people who were underestimated, more moments where someone answers and changes everything. I'll see you in the next story.